Okay, let's continue. Chapter 13, Mechanisms of Evolution. So we stopped right here. Long as voice, Darwin was strongly influenced. He was influenced by several people. Certainly, he was influenced by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who first put forth the idea that some evolutionary process was happening on Earth. But he was also influenced by this geologist Charles Lyell, the principles of geology, because he knew that his idea of natural selection was going to be a really slow process, and it had to take lots and lots of time, more time than people thought that had existed on Earth. I remember I said in the last lecture that people first thought that the Earth was still only a few thousand years old. Actually, there are still people who think that the Earth is only a few thousand years old. But a few thousand years is not going to be enough to make the diversity of life on Earth by natural selection. So this, but Lyell was the first guy that said, you know, maybe the Earth is a lot older than that, because they look at these geological formations. They took a long time. I always give the example of Sidling Hill over in west of us, where that's called an anticline. It's we see those layers with a road cut through the hill. All those layers are ancient stream bed that were crushed together by I think it was the African plate hitting the North American plate like 250 million years ago. And well, first of all, he had to lay down all that sediment over a long period of time. Then he had to crush the African plate into the North American plate to push up these mountains. Because remember, the Appalachians used to be the size of the Rockies, even higher. And then how long did it take for those mountains to erode down to the hills that they are now? A lot more than 6,000 years. So then Darwin got the idea, well, that maybe the Earth is old, like millions of years old, which would be enough time for natural selection to transform living things. And of course, now we know that the Earth is actually billions of years old. Okay, so witness the power of natural forces to change Earth's surface. Okay, when it's all an earthquake. So, okay. Okay, so like I said, he finally returned to Great Britain 5 years after he left, and he began to seriously doubt that Earth and all living organisms had to be specially created only a few thousand years earlier. So upon his return to England, Darwin reflected on his observations, analyzed his specimen collections, discussed his work with colleagues, and concluded that the evidence was better explained by a hypothesis that present-day species are the descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in his way. And as I mentioned, he brought that ornithologist and brought all the birds he brought back in. The ornithologist said, you know, all of these birds are finches, you know, and they're doing very, very unfinch-like things. So over time, differences gradually accumulated by a process that Darwin called descent with modification. His phrase is described evolution. And he proposed a mechanism for how life evolves, a process he called natural selection. In natural selection, individuals with certain inheriting traits are more likely to survive and reproduce than are individuals with other traits. So life is a struggle for existence. And if you have particular traits that allow you to survive better and live longer and make more babies, then those traits are going to be passed on to your offspring. And he was also influenced, I'm not sure whether, there might be a later slide where we talk about another influence of his, a guy named Thomas Malthus, that wrote this book called Odd Population. It talks about how populations increase in size and how resources that support that population increase in size. Let me put it on the board. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and go onto the board here. in a graph about this. So time is on the x-axis, and population of organisms on the y-axis, or resources, amount of resources. Okay. So populations increase in time in an exponential way. And that's true for microorganisms to human beings. They start off really low and they increase very slowly, and then all of a sudden they hit this exponential stage, like that. And that's how all populations increase. But resources to support the population, that is food, water, nest sites, whatever, increases like this arithmetically. So here's the critical point right here. It's called carrying capacity. You can't get too much above carrying capacity. So what happens is, when a population reaches this, so here's carrying capacity right here, and this population will go a little bit higher or lower and stay right at carrying capacity like that. And what determines this is selective factors. So selective agents in the environment that are going to kill certain individuals. And these could be biotic agents like predators, like pathogenic organisms, or could be like environmental things like droughts and volcanic eruptions and food shortages or whatever. So you're going to maintain this around carrying capacity. And like I said, it's a real struggle for existence. And most wild animals, they don't make it very natural selection kills off about 95% of all the organisms that are born, and maybe 5% have those good traits that allow them to run faster, be smarter, or live with a little less food, a little less water, and leave more babies and pass on those traits. Speaking about human beings, so where do you think we are in this growth curve? We're in the exponential phase. And back in the 12th century, there was a little dip in our population curve due to the Black Death, the bubonic plague in Europe. Now, what is our carrying capacity? In other words, how many people can survive on the earth and not well, we don't know. We haven't reached it yet, but we don't know. And sometimes these things are called density dependent factors. That is, when you get a really, really huge amount of individuals, something has to give, So anyway, so that was a guy called Thomas Malthus on population. That was one of the other influences on Darwin. Okay, let's get back to screen sharing, get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, let me, okay. So we have hypothesized that as descendants of a remote ancestor spread to various habitats over millions and millions of years, natural selection resulted in diverse modifications or evolutionary adaptations to fit them to specific ways of life in an environment. In other words, adaptive. The organisms that are most adapted to their environment will be the ones that survive. So natural selection is the most important mechanism of evolution because it's adaptive. We're going to look at other ways that organisms evolve that are more random and are not adaptive. But natural selection is the only one that's really adaptive. The other ones are not adaptive. You also might have heard the term survival of the fittest. Well, Darwin never used that term. That was used by people after Darwin to describe that. And And we may talk about fitness a little bit later on. Okay. So I spent the next 2 decades compiling and writing about the evidence of evolution, putting together, and he really delayed 20s. Nobody's really quite sure why he delayed. He knew this was going to be really controversial because he was going to come out against the church. And this is Victorian England after all. And also his wife, who was very religious. So maybe he delayed because nobody knows why, but he also wanted to be really sure and collect a really lot of evidence. He was going to make a gigantic book. But then this guy named Alfred Russel Wallace, a British naturalist doing field work in Indonesia, sent him a letter describing natural selection, the exact same idea that he came up with 20 years ago. Well, now he must have been really upset because here he's been sitting on this idea, and now he's going to be scooped by this young guy who just came up with it. So this is one of the things in science that, the big ideas, eventually somebody's going to come up with it. Mendel figured out the rules of basic rules of genetics, and then 40 years later, some other people came up with found the same rules. But those people gave homage to Mendel, just like Wallace. Well, Darwin said, yeah, I got the same idea. Let's present a paper together. So Wallace and Darwin presented a paper to the Royal Academy of Sciences, and it didn't go anywhere. No one, I guess, understood the significance of it or something. But what Darwin did next was wrote the book. As I said, on the origin of species by means of natural selection, making 2 proposals: existing species descended from an ancestral species, and natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It's an immediate bestseller, immediately highly controversial. But the book doesn't, the textbook doesn't mention his second book that he put out years later, where that's where the feces really hit the fan, because it was called On the Descent of Man. So not only was he being a heretic saying, other species evolved from early species, but man evolved from early species. Even human beings were not specially created by God. So that's what really became controversial. Okay. And there were, and really, as I said, when you put forth a new idea like this, you get young scientists to read about it and think about it and evaluate it. And it's a slow process of people finally accepting this idea, looking at the evidence and accepting it. A lot of the older scientists, who were all creationists, they really didn't buy it. And there were some really famous scientists who just wouldn't buy it. They stayed creationists until they died. And so they died as creationists. And only the younger scientists who came up agreed with Darwin, and it just spread once everybody looked at the evidence. So he's generated predictions that have been tested and verified for more than 150 years. So his concept of evolution by means of natural selection as a theory is a widely accepted explanatory idea. Broader in scope than a hypothesis, generates new hypotheses, and supported by a large body of evidence. And we're going to go over some of this evidence. There are some people, creationists, who think there isn't any evidence, but, well, they're wrong. There's lots of evidence. And we're going to go over some of it. Well, here you go. Many lines of evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution, the idea that living species are descendants of ancestral species that were different from present day ones. Okay, evolution leaves observable signs in the organisms that are still alive and in ancient organisms, in fossils and in today's organisms. Both, it leaves signs. Like I said, you can't, this is why some people say it's science, because you can't detect it, you can't see it happening in front of your face. But that's just like saying, well, you can't investigate things that happened in the past scientifically. Of course you can. I mean, what about forensic science, trying to find out how a crime happened and who did the crime? Or geology is really looking at the past. These geological processes are really slow. And so figuring out what happened in the past. Astronomy is actually looking at the past. The light that's coming from those stars left a long time ago. So of course you can investigate things that happened in the past and things that are happening really slowly. Okay, fossils. Imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the past. Document differences between the past and present organisms and show that many species have become extinct. In fact, that's the ultimate consequence of every species that lives in, every species is eventually going to be extinct. And we've had like 5 major huge extinction events over the course of geological time. Some people say we're in a 6th one right now. And this one's a little different because it's man-made. We are wiping out species, mostly by wiping out habitat, putting up malls and gas stations and car washes that are wiping out habitat. So I think some habitat should be kept wild in perpetuity for other species of organisms. Anyway, now here's the problem with the fossil record. It's an indication of ancient life, but it's a really incomplete one and really biased one toward organisms that have hard parts. Soft parts of a dead organism usually decay rapidly, and so they don't fossilize. The hard parts in animal that are rich in minerals may remain as fossils. So most of the fossils we have are like shells and teeth, things like this. Sometimes, even if you have hard parts, it's really hit or miss whether there's something fossilized. It has to die in the right place in the right way to be fossilized. And even once in a while, even soft parts are fossilized. It has to be really exactly ideal conditions. So we do have even some fossilized jellyfish, for example, but it's really rare. Mostly it's hard parts. And like one particularly incredibly successful group of living things on Earth, insects. I mean, they're just about the most successful living thing as far as number of individuals, biomass, everything. But there's almost no insect fossils, almost none, because their skeleton is carbohydrate and it doesn't fossilize. Other things eat it and it doesn't fossilize. Okay. Okay, so we have fossilized dinosaur bone here, where the bone is the minerals leach out of the calcium and phosphate leaches out of the bone and is replaced by silicon oxides, and so this bone becomes stone. Okay, and that's a hard part. Bones, shells, teeth, hard parts. Occasionally insects, you might get insects in amber, and everyone remembers this from Jurassic Park, where it had mosquitoes that had feasted on dinosaur blood trapped in amber. However, most of the insects that are trapped in amber look almost exactly the same as the insects that we have today. So you get even a 45-million-year-old insect looks the same. And this could be something else that we talk about later on, about a different hypothesis about evolution, how that's called punctuated equilibrium. It was put forth by much more modern, much more recently scientists, that actually evolution goes in fits and starts. It could be a long period of a stasis where organisms don't change that much, and all of a sudden they change relatively rapidly. And then it goes through a long stage of not being changed. Because a lot of the insects that are millions of years old, that are the case in amber, look almost identical to the insects we have today. Okay, here's a fossilized tree, right? You don't necessarily have to have hard parts. You can have indications of living things, like footprints, like dinosaur footprints. And also, uh, uh, this is only organisms that are only thousands of years old, and that is tusk of a mammoth discovered and frozen 23,000 years ago in Siberia. Okay, so like I said, not all fossils are the actual remains of organisms, can be casts that leaves an empty mold, imprints, footprints or burrows, coprolites, fossilized feces. That's important also. You can actually tell what an ancient organism ate by looking at its fossilized feces. So paleontologists are scientists who study fossils. So they are looking at things that are happening in the past. Okay. Emergence is an entire organism, including the soft parts. It is a case of a medium that prevents decomposition. Insects trapped in amber, mammoths, bison, and even prehistoric humans frozen in ice or preserved in bombs. There was a very famous one, his name was Utsi. They found him in what it was supposed to be, it's just into Italy, but it was an Austrian-Indian border and the Austrian-Italian border. And the Italians didn't want to deal with it because they just thought it was some skier that got lost and died. So the Austrians took him and they radiocarbon dated him, and it turned out to be a 5,000-year-old man. And they learned a lot about how life was 5,000 years ago from this guy. But also sometimes imprints of even really soft-bodied organisms are preserved. There's one called the Edicarian fossils that are really famous, that's showing that are like, they're like a half a billion years old, how life looked about a half a billion years ago. Okay, so the fossil records are an ordered sequence of fossils as they appear in rock layers, marking the passage of geological time. Because younger strata as a layer, is on top of older layers. The relative age of fossils can be determined by the layer in which they're found. So they isotope label the rock that the fossil is found in, and they know how long ago this organism lived. And the fossil strata are consistent over the entire world. Let me give you an example. Trilobites. They're really an ancient organism that lived 400 million years ago or more. And they're really ancient ancestors of insects. Okay, they are way below the dinosaurs, for example, which was only 60 or 70 million years ago. And the dinosaurs are lower than the mammal fossils, which evolved from mammal-like reptiles. And they're consistent all the way across the entire Earth. So as a matter of fact, it's one of this guy, I forget what his name was. He was one of what are called Darwin's champions. He's one of the early guys who read The Origin of Species and bought it and said, I think this guy is right. And this idea is so simple, I wonder why I didn't think of it. So he would go out and proselytize, in a sense, talk to groups of people about this new theory. And one guy asked him one time, what would make you doubt this theory? You know, what would really put a real doubt in your mind? He said, rabbit fossils in the Precambrian. Because a rabbit's a mammal, and it's going to be very young strata, only a few million years old. The Precambrian was 500 million years ago. That's where trilobites and even earlier organisms were. So if you found rabbit fossils down in that Precambrian strata, the real deep strata, kiss Darwin's theory goodbye. That's it. Something's wrong. This is why creationists are looking for human footprints alongside of dinosaur footprints, because they think dinosaurs and people lived at the same time. Well, if you can find a human footprint, fossilized human footprint, right next to a fossilized dinosaur footprint, you'll be right. But they haven't found it because, you know, dinosaurs predated us by 60 million years. People weren't around when dinosaurs were around. Okay. So, as I said, the fossil record is incomplete. So it's good in a sense because it talks about ancient life, but it's very incomplete because the conditions just have to be just right. Many of Earth's organisms do not live in areas of favorite fossilization. Usually they're in what's called sedimentary rock. There's two types of rock: igneous rock, which is formed from volcanoes. You're not going to find fossils in that. Sedimentary rock, rock that's laid down in streams by dirt falling down into streams and getting compacted. So you really need to have this animal die in some kind of stream or something, be buried with soil and compacted. And then there's metamorphic rock, which is igneous rock and sedimentary rock that's been subjected to great heat and stress and deformed. And you're not going to find any fossils on that rock also. So you're only going to find fossils in one type of rock, sedimentary rock. Like distorted by geological processes. So if you had good sedimentary rock and you crushed it and turned it into metamorphic rock, you've destroyed the fossil. If there was a fossil in that, you've destroyed it. And not all fossils that have been observed are accessible to paleontologists. They might be, kilometers below the Earth's surface. Okay. One of the problems that Darwin realized and even said in the book is the relative lack of what are called transitional fossils. So you should have, so if you have, you have organism A here. And over time, it evolves into two separate organisms, two different species of organisms, all right? And then those may divide into other organisms. Well, where's the organism that linked those two? So there had to be a common ancestor in the past that had characteristics of both, all right? That's called a transitional fossil. And they were at one time in Darwin's day really rare. And so what he was trying, what the reason he thought that they were rare is because the fossil record is so incomplete. You have to be really lucky for anything to have fossilized, all right? So that's why you might find them rare. Later on, another explanation was in the other theory that I mentioned, punctuated equilibrium. Their idea also why transitional organisms are so rare is because they're very short-lived. Because you have a long period of stasis where not much change happens, then all of a sudden you have this branching that happens maybe only over a few, like tens of thousands of years rather than millions. And therefore they're not on Earth that long, and then they have to be fossilized. Okay, but now there's a lot of transitional fossils. We found a lot of them. And I'll talk about later on about one that was just discovered not too long ago. That was a really important one. That is our great grandfather. Okay, so transitional fossils show a combination of traits. Like Archaeopteryx, this is one of the first really important transitional fossils that were found. It was thought to be a small dinosaur. And we used to think of dinosaurs as these big, great, terrible lizards, with the big teeth and gigantic. But most of them were really tiny things about the size of a chicken. And they ran around on two legs, like a lot of birds, like chickens. And turkeys and things. They actually don't fly that much. They usually just run around. It was thought to have been a small dinosaur that was bipedal, walking on two legs. And then they saw feather imprints. And they said, whoa, a feathered dinosaur. So it had traits, and it had teeth. So it had traits like reptiles. And it had traits like birds. And it is a really good transitional fossil between reptiles and birds. And so, and actually dinosaurs. It shouldn't say reptiles. dinosaurs really not really reptiles. They're very different from reptiles. So should be dinosaurs. Because right now it's thought that dinosaurs are in a sense still with us. Because the birds are direct descendants of dinosaurs. They're almost like living dinosaurs. They're so close to it. Okay. So fossils shed light on the origin of many types of groups of plants and animals. Okay. So like whales, cetaceans, a group that also includes dolphins and porpoises, and mammals that are thoroughly adapted to aquatic environments. And it's thought that whales went back to the sea. Now, it's thought that life first evolved in the sea, right? The first vertebrate organisms, the first chordates were fish. And fish evolved into amphibians. They crawled out onto land and became amphibians. And in fact, the transitional fossil I'm going to talk about later on, called Tiktaalik, shows that, right? But it's thought that so the ancient ancestor of whales was actually terrestrial, and they went back to the ocean. It became fully adapted to an aquatic environment. So observations of fossil teeth led paleontologists from the hypothesis that whales were descendants of primitive hoofed wolf-like carnivores. They made the prediction that transitional fossils would show reduced hind limb and pelvic bones as whales evolved from these terrestrial four-limbed ancestors. And so you can make a prediction. As a matter of fact, finding this traditional fossil I'm going to talk about it, but they made a prediction that we're going to find these organisms in rock about this old. And they went out and they found it. So you can't do a controlled experiment. Paleontologists can't do a controlled experiment because they're working with things in the past that are thousands, millions of years old. But they can make detailed measurements, make observations. Fossils accumulate over 20 years of extraordinary discoveries in Pakistan and Egypt, and the results supported their hypothesis that there's that ancient wolf-like terrestrial organism there, Pachycetus, and then became this thing right there that looks a little more streamlined for water. It became this thing right here, and modifying their limbs from walking to becoming fins and becoming living cetaceans. So it's a nice series of fossilized organisms that show this slow transition from this terrestrial carnivore to this ocean-going cetacean, who's also a carnivore. Okay. Similarity resulting from common ancestry is known as homology. So characteristics present in an ancestral organism are altered over time by natural selection as its descendants face different environmental conditions. This is also called exaptation. Because remember I talked about those feathered dinosaurs, which thought that Archaeopteryx probably couldn't fly. But it was feathered. But you know, what other role do feathers play? What other could feathers adapt to for any environment? Well, if you have a down jacket or a down comforter or something, or down sleeping bag, you'll know that feathers are really good insulation. That's why we can have these tiny little birds out in the middle of an ice cold winter, and they're fine because feathers are great insulation. And these dinosaurs were actually homeothermic. They were warm-blooded like we are. And so feathers, it's thought that feathers first evolved as thermal insulation. And then later on, maybe this little dinosaur was running from a big predator and spread its front limbs and glided a little bit, and therefore got away from the predator and lived long enough to pass that tendency of gliding onto its offspring. And then finally, maybe one of its later offspring actually flapped a little bit and glided a little bit farther. And so you can see how this could have evolved into flying. So as a result, as a related species can have characteristics that have an underlying similarity, but they function different. All right? And that's called homology. What you have to worry about, though, is something called convergent evolution. So homology is descent um, um, from similar structures that were just modified to do different things. But then sometimes you'll see two organisms that look pretty similar, but they're only similar because they faced very similar environmental challenges. For example, I always give the example of whales or dolphins, which are really streamlined, and this marine dinosaur called an ichthyosaur, which was really streamlined also, and large fish that are really streamlined. And they all look pretty similar, but they're all really distantly related to each other. That similarity is not due to homology, but by what's called convergent evolution. They're all streamlined. They all had to become streamlined. They're all really fast swimmers. And so to be a fast swimmer, you have to be really streamlined because water is a much thicker medium to go through. And so you got to be careful about that. If you think two organisms are closely related, they should have similar structures that are just doing different things. Homology rather than convergent. Okay. Darwin cited the anatomical similarities among vertebrate forelimbs as evidence of common ancestry. So we have what we call tetrapods, organisms that have four limbs, and they can become arms, forelegs, flippers, wings, all on different organisms that are doing very different things, but they're all homologous because they all have the same bones in them. Here, you've got a human arm, a cat leg, a whale fin, and a bat wing. They have the same bones. You have a humerus in your upper arm. You have what we call a radius and ulna on your lower arm. You have carpals in your wrist. You have metacarpals in your hand and phalanges. And these are all just modified. They're the same bones. They're just modified to do very different things for grasping, for walking, for swimming, and for flying. So it looks like they're all related. This is homology. So these are homologous structures, features that have different functions, but are structurally similar because of common ancestry. All right. Now, advances in molecular biology. The study of molecular bases of genes and gene expression provides a much deeper understanding of homologies. Because now, I think I've mentioned this before, scientists can read DNA, look at DNA similarities and differences between organisms, and then you can really find out how closely related organisms are by having more closely related DNA. The evolutionary history of each species is documented in the DNA inherited from its ancestral species. If two species have homologous genes with sequences that match closely, biologists conclude that these sequences must have been inherited from a relatively recent common ancestor. Conversely, the greater number of sequence differences between species, the more distant their last common ancestor. So what relatedness means, how related are you to this organism? Well, how long ago did the common ancestor live? And remember we talked about mutations. So mutations, that's part of chapter 10, which is extra credit. But when you do talk about mutations, well, these neutral mutations, this is what's called a molecular clock. Because you have an organism, these mutations happen all the time. There's a background, mutations. Mutations happen all the time. Remember, these are errors in DNA replication. And a lot of the changes are what's called neutral. They don't really change things in the organism. Well, the only thing they change is the DNA sequence. And so if two organisms are closely related, then there should be fewer differences in their DNA, fewer of these neutral mutations than between them and something more distantly related. I think I already gave this example in a much earlier lecture about a human, a squirrel in the tree and the tree. So my common ancestor with a squirrel lived probably about 100 million years ago. Our common ancestor with a tree was more like a half a billion years. So there's a lot more time for these nutrient mutations to build up. And of course, you got to use a gene that's in all three organisms. And a lot of times they use histone. Remember histone proteins. All eukaryotes have histone proteins that you wrap your DNA in. So there are genes that code for histones, right? So a tree is going to have histones. Squirrel's going to have histones. I have histones. So you look at the histone genes. And human histone genes and squirrel histone genes have, a certain X number of differences. Human histone genes compared to tree histone genes have a lot more differences because the common ancestor lived a much longer time ago, and it's a lot more time for these nutrient mutations to build up. All right. So molecular biology provides strong evidence that life forms are related. All forms of life use the same genetic language of DNA and RNA, and a genetic code, RNA triplets translated into amino acids. That's how proteins are made is universal. Everybody has the same genetic code. Everybody makes proteins in exactly the same way. So it looks like common ancestry. So bacteria engineered with human genes can produce human proteins such as insulin and human growth hormone. Transgenic organisms, since genes work the same way in all organisms, you can take a gene from one species, put it into another species, and it works. So organisms as dissimilar as humans and bacteria share some homologous genes inherited from a very distant common ancestor. They couldn't use histone genes for looking at relationships between bacteria and people because bacteria don't have histones, but they do have some genes that humans have, and so you could compare. You have to compare, like I said, a gene that's common in two organisms. Geneticists have also uncovered hidden molecular homologies. Organisms may retain genes that have lost their function due to mutations, even though homologous genes in related species are fully functional. Many of these inactive genes have been identified in humans, including genes used to produce vitamin C from glucose. Here's the thing, and these are called vestigial genes. We're going to look at vestigial organs later on, that organs that were in our ancestors that don't exist now. But we have also genes that have become inactive because these were deleterious mutations. We used to be able to make vitamin C. Most mammals can make vitamin C. Humans, primates I should say, cannot. Rodents also cannot. We have to get it in our food. So you think that this would have been so this is a deleterious mutation. And the reason it survived is because our ancestors were frugivores. In fact, our close relatives are frugivores. They eat a lot of fruit, and they get a lot of vitamin C in their diet. So there's no deficit to not being able to make vitamin C anymore. So if you were a frugivore, if the species was a frugivore and never ate fruit, and they could make vitamin C, and then all of a sudden they couldn't, the organisms would die of scurvy. That's what you die of if you don't get enough vitamin C. So we have inactive genes, and for example, in birds, they have inactive genes for teeth. Birds have genes for teeth. Why? Because their ancestors had teeth, dinosaurs, but they just stopped making them. Those genes became inactive. Except actually there's one bird, a very primitive bird that lives in South America, whose chicks have teeth, are born with teeth, and then they lose them. Okay. So vestigial structures are remnants of features that served important functions in organisms and ancestors, but then they don't work anymore. These include small pelvis and hind leg bones of ancient whales, and also leg bones in snakes. They're in there, they're internal, they're vestigial. Eye remnants in blind species of cave fishes. Goosebumps in people. These little muscles that are attached to your hair follicles. It works for organisms that are hairy over their body because it makes them look larger and more fierce. But now they don't do anything. They're useless. Goosebumps don't have any purpose, but they're still there. And that's true also for tail genes in people. We have genes for a tail because our ancestors had tails. We just don't turn them on. So those are. So why are they there? Because our ancestors used them and they got turned off, either by mutations building up on them or some other reason. Okay, homology can also explain observations about embryonic development that are otherwise puzzling. And this is what are they, as I mentioned before, one of the really great things about evolution and why it's become the bedrock of modern biology is because it's so explanatory. It can explain things that are really puzzling. For example, at some point in development, all vertebrate embryos have a tail posterior to their anus and structures called pharyngeal throat pouches that become gills in fishes or parts of the ears and throat in humans. So we had gills at one time in our embryonic development. So you look at a chicken embryo, a human embryo, post-anal tail, pharyngeal pouches, they look almost identical because there are genes that are very ancient that first evolved to put together these organisms and to put a head here and a tail here and an anus here and put pharyngeal pouches here. And then later on, the genes evolved that will modify those to become very different looking organisms. So when we're really early embryos, all mammals sort of look alike because they're using the same genes to make the basic organism, the basic organs of the organism. And then later on, genes will modify the structures to make very different looking organisms, a chicken versus a human. Okay, so let's, we're gonna move on to evolution of trees. Let's leave it there and we'll pick up on the next video. So this is gonna be 106 evolve 2. So I'll see you later in the next video lecture.